Tiếp theo thì tôi xin trân trọng giới thiệu bài trình bày của giáo sư Ben Hayat, Giám đốc Trung tâm Khoa học Chăn nuôi, Liên minh đổi mới nông nghiệp và thực phẩm Queensland với tiêu đề Công cụ genomic có thể hỗ trợ chăn nuôi và cải tiến gen ở Việt Nam như thế nào? Xin mời giáo sư. Giáo sư có 20 phút để trình bày.
Thank you. Ben's going to join us on Zoom, so hopefully just bear with us 1 minute and we can get online.
Hi there. Is my sound coming through?
Ben, I think if you can hear us, can you hear us, Ben?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can very well.
Great.
Now, would you like to share your screen or operate from us here?
No, let me share my screen.
Very good.
How's that? Is that coming through clearly?
It's coming through now. Just 1 minute. Okay, we've got your screen and we've got you. And
Fantastic.
We've got audio. So Ben, I'll turn over to you. Thanks for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much. Good morning all, and good to be with you again. So just to start off with, the starting point of this talk is just a reiteration of the key drivers of productivity and profitability in the beef industry. And our Wayne covered this quite nicely, and our previous speakers did as well. But just to emphasize, fertility is a really key trait in beef production, particularly as conditions get harsher and harsher. So in parts of our Northern Australian beef production system, fertility, the number of kilograms of beef that a cow produces over her lifetime, is by far and away the key driver of profitability in those systems. Just to link to some of the talks yesterday, if you can improve fertility, improve the kilograms of beef produced per cow, you also have the nice side effect of reducing methane per kilogram of beef. Of course, meat quality is also important depending on what market you're targeting. And to link back to yesterday again, in the future, methane is going to become more and more important. Depending on the environment you're operating in, adaptation is also critical. And of course, as the environment gets harsher and harsher, adaptation is more and more important. So some of these traits are not particularly easy to select for in a traditional breeding program. For example, selecting the bull with the best fertility genetics in a traditional system, you really need to wait till that bull has daughters and then determine whether those bull's daughters get in calf or not before you have really good information on that bull's genetics. So that can be quite a difficult and slow process to improve the genetics of fertility. Some of the other traits are like this as well. For example, meat quality. It's hard to get meat quality directly on a bull because you have to slaughter the animal to get the quality, the amount of intramuscular fat, for example. So you really need to look at his offspring or siblings. So one way we can speed up the rate of genetic gain or start to really improve these traits is through genomic selection. And many of you will know how this works, but I'll just briefly give you a little bit of a revision. So if you want to have genomic selection, so selection on DNA markers for a trait, the starting point is a large reference population of animals that is both measured for the trait, for example, fertility, and also genotyped for genome-wide markers. We need those markers across the genome because we know for traits like fertility and indeed meat quality, growth and so on, there are many genes underlying the variation in those traits scattered across the genome of our animals. So you really do need lots of markers across the genome to track all those mutations. So once you've set up that reference population, you have many animals with genotypes, genome-wide DNA markers. You also have them measured for the trait. You can then derive what's called a prediction equation. So you can work out for each DNA marker what the effect of that marker is on the trait. And typically we might work with 50,000 markers across the genome. So our prediction equation would be 50,000 weights, each corresponding to how much variation each marker is actually picking up. And because the effects of each gene are quite small, the effect of each marker is going to be quite small. But when you sum them up across the genome, you're going to capture all of that variation. And once you have that prediction equation, you're really in business, because you can go to your selection candidates, your young bull and heifers, genotype them, run them through the prediction equation, and get genomic breeding values, estimates of the value of their genetics to the next generation. And then you can make selection decisions on young animals, breed from them early, and accelerate genetic gain. So this concept, I guess, really started being implemented in a serious way in the dairy industries around the world in about 2008. Since then, it's spread to many other livestock and, in fact, plant crop species as well. And if you sum up around the world the number of animals that have been genotyped to drive genomic selection, it's something in the order of 20 million animals have been genotyped. So it's really being used in quite a serious way. It is having an impact as well. Just to show you some examples from Australia, I could use examples from the US and other places as well. The first graph is the uptake of genotyping in Australia. So you have your time on the x-axis there, number of animals genotyped on the y-axis. That's actually almost doubled since we put this graph together in the past 2 years. So it's now in the order of 500,000 animals genotyped in Australia for the purposes of genomic selection. For dairy cattle in Australia, we implemented genomic selection in 2010 in dairy cattle in Australia. And you can see in this graph the impact that it's had on, in this case, fertility. So up to 2010, there was a real problem in dairy cattle. Fertility was declining quite quickly, and that was because there was strong selection on milk production. Some of the same genes that drive increase in milk production are unfavorably correlated with fertility. So fertility was rapidly dropping. When we implemented genomics, we put quite a high weight in the index on fertility. And you can see in 2010, this really allowed fertility to be turned around. So on the x-axis of that graph is time. On the y-axis is fertility. This is our fertility breeding value, which is based on 6-week in-calf rate. And you can see after that 2010 rate, fertility has been improving, and dairy farm profitability has actually been improving. So it's having this technology of genomic selection is really having an impact. Back to beef cattle, and I want to focus now particularly on beef cattle in perhaps challenging environments like our Northern Australian beef industry. Just like in Vietnam, just like the previous speaker demonstrated, we have a very large number of breeds in Northern Australia. We have a lot of crossbreeds, composites, and we have 2 subspecies, Bos taurus and Bos indicus. We also have the problem that, unlike in our dairy industry, traits are not routinely recorded in these animals. There's not much routine recording. We also have extensive conditions, which is different to the Vietnamese situation, but I'll come back to that. So this is perhaps the most difficult situation for genomic selection. You've got all these different breeds, in fact, different subspecies. You've got a situation where you don't have traits recorded. How do you actually get genomic selection up and running in this situation? So this is exactly what we did in our Northern Genomics project. So I just want to take you through what we did in that project so you can see an example of how to get genomic selection up and running in challenging conditions or in a challenging situation. So what we did was enlist collaborator herds around Northern Australia, 60 collaborator herds, in fact. Those herds represented a large number of breeds and crossbreeds, and you can see that in the pie chart there. There were Brahmins, Angus, a little bit of Wagyu even, composites, Droughtmaster, all kinds of breeds. So we really do have a multi-breed situation there. So we knew to make this work, we were going to need a very large reference population, a large number of animals that were genotyped and recorded. So in these 60 herds, that covered nearly 30,000 animals that we genotyped and recorded. The other problem that I alluded to earlier is there's no routine recording here. So you somehow have to come up with a trait that you can record in a large number of animals in these conditions that is related to profitability. So the trait we ended up screening all these heifers for was a trait very closely related to age at puberty. It's not age at puberty. It was whether the heifers were cycling or not at 600 days of age. And the way we assessed this trait was by ultrasound scanning. So you can see one of our scanners there. That's Jeffrey Fordyce. He did most of the 30,000 heifers, which was an incredible effort. And he's scanning that heifer to look to see if she's cycling or not, if she has a corpus luteum or not. That heifer puberty trait, the reason we chose that is, just as Wayne was describing, that's quite closely related or quite reasonably correlated to lifetime productivity of a cow, the number of calves a cow is going to have over its lifetime. And it's quite very closely related to age at puberty. The correlation's about 0.8. All the heifers, the 30,000 heifers, were also genotyped with 50,000 markers and genotyped up to up to a very large number of markers to enable this multi-breed genomic evaluation. So just to go into a little bit more detail on the traits, it wasn't just heifer puberty. We also recorded weight, hip height, more importantly, body condition score. You can see the numbers there. The other thing we did was look at the heritability of this data. And we did this as a quality check. This was really the first time that data had been collected on such a large scale in commercial herds, non-stud herds. There was no pedigree in this data. All the information between animals is based on the genomics. So we wanted to see if we were getting sensible heritabilities from this data, a quality control. And in fact, the heritabilities do look good. So weight, 30%, that's pretty reasonable. Body condition score, 22%. That's pretty consistent with literature estimates. Our fertility traits, as I said, our heifer puberty trait turned out to be the heritability, 22%. So of all the variation between the animals, 22% is genetic in origin. That's pretty good for a fertility trait. The other trait we measured was a rebreed trait. Could the cows get backing calf when they were lactating? So could they get pregnant or not 4 months after calving. This is a rebreed trait, and the heritability of that was a little bit lower, but, well, quite a bit lower, but still useful. Okay, we also measured temperament, because that's of concern to many of our farmers. That turns out to be a very, or quite a heritable trait, so you can make pretty quick progress on that. We also measured 2 adaptation traits, so parasite-resistant traits, ticks and buffalo fly. And buffalo fly is a biting fly that leaves behind nasty lesions on the hide. And tick score was surprisingly heritable. Buffalo fly lesion score a little bit less so, but still a reasonable genetic component. So that convinced us that this data was of good quality, and we could go far further and start giving back information to our farmers. So just to show you what we do give back, and this may be an interesting template, I guess, for what any program could give back to participating farmers. One thing we did was benchmark each farm's genetics against the average of all the herds across Northern Australia. So this is just a quick snapshot that farmers can use to see where the genetics of the animals they have are at. And just to explain it quickly, if you had an average herd, if you were bang on average, you would expect to see 20% of your animals in the top 20%, 20% in the next 20%, and so on. So equal bands of colour for each trait. You can see the graph there for the average herd. Now, if you look at this particular herd for heifer puberty, it's actually worse than average. It has very few animals in that top 20%. It only has 5% or so on. So on average, or in this herd, most of the animals are cycling late, going through heifer puberty late. They're less fertile. They also have low weights, but they're quite tall. So these may be tall, not very fertile cows. So if a farmer got back this herd report, this benchmark, we would suggest they start focusing on fertility, really look at buying bulls with good fertility. The farmers, and this is now a routine service in Australia that we offer, can get back genomic breeding values on individual animals, as well as these herd profiles. So for each trait, they get back a breeding value, and they get back a ranking of where that animal sits compared to all the other animals in Northern Australia. So they can say these animals are in the top 20%, they're worth breeding from. These animals are in the bottom 20%, not worth breeding from. And if you want any more information on this, this large project we ran, it's in this paper that was very recently published. Okay, so I think this is a nice template, and it gives you an idea of what you really need to do to get genomic breeding values up and running for, let's say, an industry in challenging environments. One really key difference that you're going to have in Vietnam compared to the Australian situation is in our herds, we have, well, in the data set I just showed you, the minimum herd size I had was 50 in a heifer cohort. The largest heifer cohort was about 600 or 700. So we had very large groups of animals in a cohort. And when you do these genetic evaluations, it's very important that you have quite a number of animals in the same cohort, in the same environment. So the differences are arguably just genetic. So you can disentangle the genetics from the environment in your evaluation. Now, the question is, how small can your herd be, and can you still have power to disentangle the genetics and environment? Or when does it just become impossible to do that? I've been working with an organisation called BIDV in India for the past 5 years on getting genomic selection up and running for their dairy cattle and dairy buffalo populations. And this was a really important problem for us to look at in those populations, because the average herd size in India, in the areas we were working in, was about 1.5. So a lot of the herds were just one animal. There were some larger, 4 or 5, but the average herd size was 1.5. So we ran some analysis to see what was the smallest herd size you could look at that still gave you accurate genomic evaluations. And this was work done by a colleague of mine, Roy Castilla. You can see on the x-axis you have the average farm size. On the y-axis is it's not the accuracy, it's the reliability of the prediction. So the accuracy squared. And the different color boxes are different heritabilities. So the higher heritability you have, the higher your accuracy of prediction. But if you only have one animal in the herd, you have a very challenging time you can't disentangle the genetic effect from the environmental effect. So even if you measure 10,000 herds, all of size 1, that information is essentially useless because you can't disentangle it. If you go to 2 animals in the herd, you start to get a little bit of power. When you have 5 animals in the herd, you really do have some ability to disentangle the genetic effect and the environmental effect. And in fact, there's not much change between 5 and 20. So when we did this work in India, we were advising our partners to set up reference sets to drive genomic selection with at least 3 cows in the herd as a minimum. So I think that's a really important point when you're setting up your reference populations for genomic selection. And people have made the mistake of just doing 1 animal per herd. You get into lots of trouble. But if you go for 3, you can actually make some progress and do it quite well. So just to summarize, there are now good genomic models available to develop multi-breed, multi-species genomic breeding value. It's possible. The key thing is actually to get large numbers of animals genotyped and measured really well for traits. So you can get these GBV for selection without pedigree. Our conclusion is it's actually, if you have to focus your efforts, it's better to focus efforts on recording traits really well and let the genomics pick up relationships between animals rather than focus effort on pedigree. It's that trait recording that's really important. Once you have these GBV, as Wayne alluded to, you can use the genomics to accelerate genetic gain by selecting and breeding from animals as early as possible. It's no good just having the genomic breeding values. You have to do something with it. The thing you do differently is breed from animals as early as possible. And I think the good news is in smallholder systems, even relatively small herds can be used as a reference as long as you don't go too small. So thank you very much again, and just thank you to all the people that were involved in the results that I presented. So thank you very much.